Thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and I want to thank the committee and the staff and faculty of the Wynnicott Center, especially Meir and Michal, for their Hachnasat Orchim. Haya me'uleh. Okay. So this paper is called An Allegiance to Absence, Phantom Pain, and the Mirror Box. Jenny rocks back and forth as she speaks, her hands covering her face. We have spent the session experiencing the depths of her despair, traveling back in time together to a harrowing episode in which her mother drove under the influence of mind-altering drugs, crashing the car, almost killing them both. As she speaks, we are transported, immersed together in the totality of her experience of that night. Towards the end of the session, I ask Jenny how she feels. I feel like a hole, she tells me in a tiny voice. Like you're in a hole, I ask her. No, like I am a hole, she answers. Like there's a pit, an indentation, a nothing in the place where I am supposed to be. Many describe encounters with patients suffused with feelings of deadness, emptiness, and lack, in what has been referred to as the black hole or void in internal experience. This internal absence is often connected to an early separation from the mother that traumatizes the child, bringing up overwhelming fears of annihilation. Because the infant has not yet developed the ability to symbolize the absence of the object, it is dependent on the concrete presence of the mother to feel safe. As Wynnicott explained, if the mother is apart from her child, her image remains alive in his mind for X minutes. After X minutes, her image starts to fade. If she stays away X plus Y minutes, the child is in distress, but still has not been irreversibly transformed. But in X plus Y plus Z minutes, the baby has become traumatized. In X plus Y plus Z minutes, the mother's return does not mend the baby's altered state. Trauma implies that the baby has experienced a break in life's continuity, so that primitive defenses now become organized to defend against a repetition of unthinkable anxiety. When a child experiences the loss of the mother that is too sudden, too early, or too long, it brings up the nameless dread of catastrophic abandonment. Traumatic separation leads to unthinkable anxiety that must be defended against at all costs, as all ensuing separations bear the threat of this paradigmatic, unendurable separateness. The gap between self and other having become an infinite, timeless void experienced as too painful to bear. In order to avoid re-experiencing the trauma of early abandonment, the child may attempt to deny his separateness using omnipotent fantasy and autistic defenses, creating an unrelated shell self built around a fragmented interior that must exert energy to plug up the hole in his vulnerable core, through remaining mortally defended, isolated, and related to an enclosed world of internal objects and inanimate things rather than people. This encapsulation keeps the child safe from experiencing his separateness and from the traumatic knowledge of his need for the other. But at the core is an abyss. These patients, absent of themselves, remain preoccupied with what is not there, in dialogue with a ghostly imprint where a presence should be. Wynnicott elaborates that from the child's perspective, there's a time when the mother is dead but can come back to life, and past that, a point when she is felt to be dead forever. As this change takes place, the child experiences a moment of anger, a protest that is passed over, then lost, as the new reality of the mother's indelible absence takes hold of the psyche. There are thus dual dangers looming. There is the menace of catastrophic aloneness, threatening breakdown from without, and the unexperienced, violent reaction to the original separation, threatening fragmentation from within. The absence becomes the reality, as Winnicott's patient explained. Referring to her previous analyst, she told him that the negative of him is more real than the positive of you, such that in his absence, her former analyst felt more psychically real than did Wynnicott, the accessible analyst sitting right in front of her. What was unavailable felt more actual, more soothing as representative of the bond with the absent mother than the presence, which held the potential to threaten her very existence. Winnicott's patient must hold on to the absence, the gap having become the barrier beyond which lies certainty of annihilation. Green explains that for Winnicott's patients and others like her, the non-existence will become at some point the only thing that is real, which brings about a sense of futility and cynicism about the power of human bonds. All I have got is what I have not got, Winnicott's patient continues. What she has not got has become her everything, serving as the very core of her identity, the void around which her experience of herself is fundamentally structured. Patients with a negative investment often feel burdened by having to deal with people, experiencing the need to interact with others as coercive, demanding, or intrusive. But it is important to keep in mind that, as Green states, this is linked less with aggression than with nothingness. This nothingness, a tear in the fabric of significance in self-other representation, an absence at the core of the self, which if given up could lead to fragmentation or an interruption in an experience of self-coherence. This allegiance to absence can produce a clinical situation that feels empty, as if, lonely, deadened, or superficial, leading to potential difficulties in the course of a treatment. The process of early traumatic dissociation has been compared by Eshel to a form of autotomy, or self-amputation, in which an organism cuts off the part of the self that is in danger for the sake of the survival of the whole. Just as an animal may sever its own limb to escape a predator, a person in psychic peril may cut off and attempt to leave a part of himself behind through dissociative processes to ensure that the rest of him will live on. While Eshel links this dissociation specifically to experiences of intrusion in the development of perversion, Gurevich extends this metaphor to include early experiences of abandonment and neglect. She explains that the loss of the object is a ripping away of what feels like a vital piece of the self. The mortal dread of annihilation, which separateness induces, causes the child to detach the part of itself related to primary dependence for the sake of his survival. Functional aspects of the person will remain, but with the amputation and dissociation of a primal part of the self, there's a lingering void, a phantom pain in which the central structural focus paradoxically becomes the thing in its absence. If we follow the metaphor of the biological phenomenon of autotomy, we see that with the physical amputation of a limb, there is often an accompanying pain experienced as originating from the appendage that is no longer connected to the body. This sensation of physical discomfort, localized in a detached limb, is termed phantom pain, and can be a chronic after effect of amputation. Discomfort in an absent part of the body is a problem the nervous system cannot work out, which is why the pain becomes chronic and unresolvable. There is an ache in a piece of the self separated from the body. No longer connected, it still manifests in phantom physical discomfort. Just as there is a phantom pain for amputees concentrated in what is no longer a part of the self, so too does a person who has split off a dissociated part of himself become repetitively drawn to what is not there. When an amputee experiences phantom pain in a missing limb, there is no direct way to alleviate the distress, as the part of him that experiences the suffering is not there to be ministered to, being no longer connected to the body. With early experiences of abandonment, there is a similar phantom pain evoked by an absence that was dissociated, cut off before it could be known or registered by the self. A unique treatment for phantom pain in amputees has been developed in the medical field that is termed the mirror box. This procedure relies on visual representation as a tool for integration in order to alleviate distress in a missing limb. In this type of therapy, a special box constructed with strategically placed mirrors inside is used to give the patient a visual experience of possessing both limbs. The patient places his intact appendage in the box, and its mirror image provides an illusion of the missing limb's presence. As a part of the treatment, the patient is led through symmetrical exercises in view of both the intact limb and the representation of the missing one. As he goes through the exercises, the patient is encouraged to imagine that he is seeing his missing limb moving. Connecting sensorially to the visual representation of what is absent has been shown to bring relief to those suffering from the phantom pain of amputated limbs. And there you can see, that's what a real mirror box looks like. The mirror box connects the amputee on the most basic sensory level to what is no longer there, so that he can incorporate the traumatic loss into what he knows about himself. A similar process occurs in the treatment of dissociation in psychoanalysis. What is missing must be first experienced on a sensory level, then represented in the treatment, so that a deep primary knowledge of the absence can be symbolized, accepted, and integrated in an organic way that does not call up defenses related to traumatic intrusion. But just as an amputee cannot be simply told with words that what feels like an attached limb is no longer a part of him, a psychoanalytic patient cannot be told simply with words that an experience of absence has been dissociated from his experience of himself. For an integration to occur, the piece that is missing must be accessed from a more basic register of sensory experience. This more basic register is on the level of the experiencing self, in the mode of perception over apperception. This primary sensory register bypasses the narrative structure imposed on experience by higher order intellectual functioning of the mind, which can be defensive in nature. The mirror box treatment for phantom pain is analogous to psychoanalytic treatment, in which the patient, together with the analyst, go through a process of dreaming up the missing part of him, assigning it novel psychic significance. This undertaking is one in which what is absent becomes accessible on a basic level through an active engagement with internal objects in a mirroring relationship, often first coming to be known by the analyst, who then makes it available, representable, and thus knowable to both analyst and patient. The mirror box is a non-invasive method for treating phantom pain, and so too must psychoanalytic treatment be non-invasive in accessing deep experiences of traumatic dissociation. Communication through words, especially ones that draw attention to the separateness of the patient and analyst, can attenuate the elaboration of the patient's inner experience by arousing vigilance. A psychoanalytic treatment, like the mirror box, is one in which the absent appendage comes to life in the imagination through creative enactment in the transference-countertransference field. As Milner wrote, the other has to be created before it can be perceived. The primary attachment, or absent thereof, becomes actualized in the relationship between patient and analyst, the unique manifestations of which bring to life the absence in the here and now, where it can be experienced and transformed. Paradoxically, the absence of connection can change into the presence of absence, once represented and symbolized, generating novel psychic significance. Though the metaphor of phantom pain most likely applies to many forms of early traumatic dissociation, in which a piece of the self is sacrificed for the survival of the whole, I would like to focus on the phantom pain of internal absence, in which the child must cut off what was not there. We might ask ourselves, what part of the self has been severed and dissociated in the case of internal absence? What part of the patient has been cut off in fantasy, only to become the source of chronic phantom pain? Some have used the motif of the ripping away of the mother's breast from the mouth of the infant as paradigmatic of the trauma of early abandonment. I believe it is more compelling to think of the early loss of an intrinsic piece of the self in terms of a premature disruption in the umbilical connection to the mother. The severing of the umbilical link in utero is a life or death scenario that evokes annihilation and most likely leads to overwhelming terror of separateness or disconnection. If the womb is an absent or hostile environment for whatever reason, it may be felt as a death-giving rather than life-giving organ. The baby must choose between the total absence of this maternal connection or its total presence. When connected, the patient feels merged, attached to the primary other through the umbilical tie to his mother, with no control over his interior or exterior experience, trapped and subject to the whim of an overpowering other with the authority to disrupt him at his core, upsetting the basic integrity of the self. The other alternative is to cut himself off, dissociating the connection completely. The umbilical cord amputated from the body in an act of self-preservation leaves him mortally isolated, cut off from all sources of life, with a gaping void in his center. As the traumatic severing of self from other occurs before the acquisition of language, and is defined by an act of omission rather than commission, there are no words nor any meaningful actions available to the patient with which to represent what is missing. It requires the work of two psyches, two bodies and minds in communion with each other to dream up an absence within the mirror box of psychoanalytic treatment. More pointedly, in addition to a lack of representability of absence, there is often a lack of a framework within which to create internal representations, and which holds the capability to contain the experiences of emptiness in the self. Because of the intensity of fear that separateness evokes, there is no structure or experience of internal space with which to hold the absence, and there is no blank background against which anticipatory fantasy can arise that spans external and internal worlds. Without this framework, the child cannot imagine what is absent, instead shielding the self from its knowledge through denial of difference. The totality of the experience of absence gives rise to a fantasy of reparative total presence. But the polarized nature of this dialectic, total presence and total absence, does not allow a third in-between space to emerge that makes way for the creation of meaning. Over the course of their process, the analytic couple comes to represent the lack of representation, the absent object manifesting itself through deep engagement with the other in the mirror box of psychoanalytic treatment. But not only does the absence become lived out between patient and analyst, but so too does the countervalent wish for the reparative total presence of the mother. This primal wish for merger, amputated at an early age, can be re-experienced in the imaginative space of the analytic frame. As Winnicott's patient mentioned above told him, "I suppose I want something that never goes away." Thus, not only the experience of the original absence comes to life in the lived experience of the analytic process, but also the missing experience of the total presence of the maternal figure which can be surrendered to in a fantasy of completeness. The fantasy of merger must be represented and mourned in psychoanalysis, just as a lost limb must be mourned after its knowledge has been integrated through mirror box treatment. The primary link that has been missing can never be returned, but the integrative psychic work of suffering the pain of this absence can be made possible through the process of reflection, symbolization, and attribution of meaning. The dissociated state of total dependence and its absence are both conjured up through creative imaginings, dreamed up in the mirror box of the transference-countertransference matrix. The conjunction of the analytic couple who engage in dialogue verbally and nonverbally, in body and in mind, give meaning to what is being experienced, turning what once felt frighteningly meaningless into a source of meaning itself. In the vignette described above, for example, Jenny and I first felt merged together in an idealized mother, idealized baby, transference-countertransference, in which there was an implicit promise that our connection could hold her trauma in a way that would last forever, an experience of total presence. Asking a question that pointed to our separateness, the fact that I couldn't read her mind and was aware of the approach of the end of the session, ripped us apart into a state of two-ness that left her feeling erased from my mind, an experience of total absence, most likely causing her to defensively erase herself. Points of contact such as these can be connected up to create a matrix that approximates the missing framework for the creation of meaning. What follows is a continuation of this case example that illustrates the way a dissociated internal absence was repeatedly enacted in a treatment. The analytic framework became a mirror box that encased repeated representation of this motif, each time from a slightly different angle, each time with a slightly different point of view. The theme of absence persistently appeared and disappeared and was experienced and articulated at differing levels of development and of reality, creating a chain of levels that became meaningful through repeated experience of enactment and representation within the therapeutic relationship. This eventually resulted in the internalization of a framework within which to imagine and give meaning to the absent object. Okay, the case of Jenny. When she arrived at my office for our first visit, Jenny immediately struck me as slight and pale, with her long hair pulled back in an austere bun, and dressed in dark colors that accentuated her pallid complexion. calling to mind the stark image of a ghost. A 32-year-old freelance journalist, Jenny entered into our meeting with an air of shyness and approached our relationship tentatively, never seeming to have been asked about her internal experience before, and never having paid much attention to it herself. From the start, she seemed detached, far away, and unreachable, and I felt similarly far away from her myself. Jenny grew up in a middle-class home in a rural area with her father, her mother, and a brother 3 years older than her. She described a neglected childhood in which she felt isolated and unseen, remembering being left alone to play by herself or watch television for extended stretches of time. When Jenny was 8 years old, her parents divorced. After that, her father moved out of the house along with her older brother. Her father told Jenny that she had to stay behind so that her mother would not feel abandoned. So Jenny was left alone in the house to accommodate and contend with an erratic mother who was addicted to painkillers and marijuana, depressed, and constantly in and out of tumultuous relationships. She was forced to care for herself and her mother, but her most prevalent memory was of spending hours and hours alone in her room with the door shut, isolated and dejected, with her mother similarly barricaded in her own room next door. Jenny said that she came to therapy because she felt that people seemed to lose interest in her quickly, and reasoned that this was because she was boring. She spent stretches of time following strangers who seemed interesting to her through the streets, buying things they bought, tasting things they ate, trying to mimic their behavior in a way that would somehow make her less forgettable. In her attempts to fit in, she emptied herself, erased herself as she called it, becoming a chameleon as she drained herself of her own desires. In her attempts to understand what was missing inside, she minutely reconstructed her interactions with people in our sessions, describing conversations with acquaintances and dealings with professional colleagues at length. As we started our 3-time-a-week treatment, one of the first things she told me was that she tries to distract people by being vivacious and accommodating over here, pointing to herself, while what's really going on is over there on the side, pointing to the empty place next to her on the couch. She explained that was where there's a part of her that she didn't want anyone to see, the absent part, in despair, abject, terrified, and desperate for help. Though she described this other state over there on the side to me in a tone devoid of affect, I felt that she was telling me something important about her inner world, and made a mental note of the imperative to keep the existence of this absent part of her alive in my mind as a vital element of our work together. But even as she described this other, more vulnerable part of herself, Jenny came across as utterly impassive. Especially at first, Jenny appeared to be hesitant and guarded about entering into our relationship. Though the material we talked about always seemed rich, and we always seemed to be doing good work, Jenny felt far away and detached. At times I felt dismayed at how unreachable she seemed, but still tried to allow and make space for what was present on a basic level, challenging her assumptions about her internal sense of badness, putting her feelings into context, and remaining especially sensitive to her unexpressed early needs, attempting to build trust and provide a holding environment in order to facilitate access to these more vulnerable states. As time went on and she began to intermittently experience her affect, Jenny's feelings tended to flood and overwhelm her. She experienced intense somatic symptoms in sessions. For instance, she described a feeling of calm as cool rain in her feet, and a feeling of despair as a burning sensation radiating out of her belly button up into her torso. Remarkably, when these acute experiences arose between us, I felt her intense internal sensation in my body too, her descriptions of what was going on inside of her seeming to enter into and change my own internal experience, her words physically transforming and giving shape to my feelings as if they were a pliant lump of clay. Jenny was both indifferent to my presence and exquisitely sensitive to any intrusion. At times, even my gestures and the rhythm of my breath seemed to impinge on her ability to think. What seemed confounding and unique to me about our work was that though we made genuine contact in these powerful and intense moments, and though these experiences seemed to erase all distance between us, our link seemed to dissolve in the very minute Jenny left my office. I started to realize I wasn't thinking of Jenny between sessions, even after we shared deep experiences together. For example, After the session in which we relived the terrifying night of the car accident described above, I did not think of Jenny again till right before our next meeting, when I reviewed my notes, internally wincing as the effective intensity of her story flooded back into my awareness. But instead of thinking of her, I remembered her with a tinge of guilt in terms of the lack of thought I was giving her. I only recalled her in her absence. I came to see our experiences of deep connection as encapsulated pockets of aliveness, oases surrounded by long stretches of deadness in which the bulk of our meetings lacked effective intensity, and the only thing binding us seemed our mutual sense of duty to one another. We were in the midst of one of these long, mutually withdrawn stretches when I started to notice that as Jenny was speaking, I often sat in the same characteristic position I usually do when I'm with my own analyst. Though I think about my analyst when I'm with other patients, it's usually an identification with her as analyst, as in, what would my analyst say in this situation? Now with Jenny, I realized that instead of identifying with my analyst, I was identifying with myself as patient, as in, I miss my analyst. Maybe I should call her and ask for an extra session this week. I started to realize that these musings during our sessions were reflective of my dissociated needs, and perhaps of Jenny's too. I began to wonder about this, about what else we were keeping out of the room, and what else was in the room that was unarticulated, unformulated, stirred up. What aggression, what fears, what desires? Where was the vulnerable part of Jenny in the empty spot next to her on the sofa, over there on the side? And why couldn't I connect to her? A potential space had opened up where it had previously been collapsed, allowing reverie to start to emerge as a symbolizing process between us. I realized I had been privileging the experiences in which her younger states emerged, using them as proof of our connectedness, and lost my faith in our bond the more time we spent in a state of detachment. It occurred to me that I had been thinking of her withdrawal as a defense against loss, rather than the representation of a specific form of object relationship, a relationship to an absent mother. Though nothing between us changed externally, I began to get more in touch with my own loneliness and fears of abandonment, along with a deep wish for closeness with Jenny that I had previously kept out of awareness. Reinvigorated, I began to make a point of thinking about what might be happening inside of Jenny, working to consciously keep her experience in mind, at times even visualizing a live and beating heart inside of her, wondering about the inner workings of a separate subject with a center of gravity and intelligence and an internal spark all her own. In the week following these realizations, Jenny brought in a dream. I have this little baby and I'm supposed to feed it, but I keep losing it. I first start to feed it and then I lose it. Then I find it again and feel relieved, but then I lose it again. I keep scrambling to find it and then settle down, but as soon as I relax and start feeding it, it disappears again. It was a frantic dream. In the discussion that followed, Jenny associated to her recent experiences of losing several of her personal effects. Over the course of 2 months, she had lost her phone, an expensive leather jacket, and a set of keys, all of which she found again soon after. I was curious about what this losing and finding could represent. Was there some part of her without words that kept getting lost in our work together? Was she attempting to alert us to the possibility that something in her was missing and needed to be found? The urgency of the experience was striking. Thinking of her dream, I said, maybe it feels like there's a piece of you that we keep losing and finding over and over again, a piece that is hungry and needs to be fed. Jenny nodded, then went on to tell me about the bulimic issues with eating that she had long been keeping secret from everyone, including me. She described the way she restricted her food intake for extended periods of time, and then compulsively binged on rich foods that filled her up till she made herself sick. She felt ashamed of her problems with eating and connected them to the experience of the infant in the dream that she couldn't keep hold of. Jenny said that in her core, there is this small person, my little self. She's not capable, she's too young. It's just me by myself, there's no family, and it's without love. It's like a vacuum. It feels like there's hardly air. Jenny's chest started heaving as she spoke, as if gasping for air. I can't breathe, she said. Unsettled, I felt myself deliberately slow down, grounding myself in my body, pushing through my own anxiety in an attempt to help regulate both of us. Eventually, Jenny's breathing began to slow down, but she remained distraught. I could sense that she felt alone with her feelings, as if her words and affect kept ricocheting back at her in an isolated space all her own. I felt that she needed something from me, but I was paralyzed, unable to think. Jenny left the session unsoothed. In the following sessions, she felt far away, deadened, intellectually engaged in reflecting on the session and the feelings that came out of it, but emotionally absent from our relationship. There didn't seem a way back to the effective experiences of that session. Dismayed at what felt like a lost opportunity to build on our connection, I thought about Jenny after our session and brought up what happened between us in supervision. As my supervisor and I discussed the ways I kept myself from being too involved in Jenny's traumatized states for fear of intruding on or injuring her, we came to a pause in our conversation. My attention became unfocused, my mind wandered. In that moment, I imagined with great clarity an image of me and Jenny sitting together in my office, an inert body laid out between us. Gray, corpse-like, almost Frankensteinian, it rested on a block with IV tubes coming out of each of its arms. One of the IVs ran from the prostrate body to Jenny's arms, and the other to mine. Each of us connected to this lifeless mass, infusing it with our own blood, each of us feeding it, sustaining it, keeping it on life support in some limbo state between life and death. When I imagined the corpse coming to life, I became flooded with dread. I realized then that I had been unconsciously invested in keeping something dead between me and Jenny, and that in fact we were both invested in keeping something deadened, something immobilized and frozen in ourselves and our relationship. As I mused about this image and how it reflected what was happening within and between me and Jenny, I connected back to my childhood. I realized that because of my allegiance to my own internalized dead mother, I had been avoiding stirring up and experiencing certain feelings in our work together. It was an early relationship in which I committed myself to enlivening the dead other and remained dedicated to this impossible task, the structure of which formed the basis of our bond and as such was never meant to change. This most recent enactment helped me to see more clearly the ways I had been dropping things that came up. On a conscious level, I smoothed things out to protect Jenny, but I was also unconsciously enacting the role of the absent mother, participating in keeping the deadness alive, to guard myself and Jenny from the pain of our separateness. This new awareness of the internal resonances between us freed me to engage in a more lively way with Jenny. I felt more empowered to pursue the meanings and impact of our rupture, to keep the uncomfortable feelings open despite her anxiety and my own fears of being intrusive, and to face what might happen to our link if something new transpired between us. In our next session, Jenny started out by painstakingly recounting in a lifeless tone how everyone in her office was somehow featured in an article in a local magazine except for her. I brought up the theme of erasure and connected it to the way I had left her alone in the session when she had experienced the panicked breathing. I had left her alone by not stepping in, I told her, effectively erasing her. She looked surprised and went back to the stark image in her mind of the little girl at the center of a vast void. As Jenny returned to this image, the feelings of panic began to rise inside of her again, her breath becoming more constricted and her body rocked side to side in an effort to self-soothe. Jenny, I said, determined to stay alive and connected, when you look at the void, can you see its edges? How far out does it go? Yes, she answered. It's like there's a pool of black, but I can also see a shoreline at its edge. Can you imagine anyone inside the void together with you? I asked. No, she answered, but I guess I can visualize you on the edge of the void, looking in, wanting to join me. The look of panic in Jenny's wide eyes began to fade, and her breath began to slow as we fell into a deep silence. We had never previously experienced a silence together. Our sessions filled up with many words, whether they were used to communicate or distance. The silence felt profound, weighty, and I found myself imagining a very young Jenny swaddled up tightly in a blanket, nestled on my chest. Jenny seemed similarly occupied with thoughts of her own, and the silence felt alive and grew. After a few minutes, Jenny told me that being alone was a foundational assumption that she brought into every relationship, and this aloneness was what felt most true. Being alone felt like less of a risk, safe, she said, like a refuge. I can really understand that, I responded, pausing for a moment. But maybe that's what being mothered feels like to you. Being in a room with the door shut, all by yourself. That's what it was like to be with your mother, and maybe when you start to feel need, that's the kind of relationship you go back to. After a moment, I continued. But I wonder what it would have felt like for someone to come knocking on the door back then, or for me to come knocking on it now. I probably have been wishing for that for a long time, she answered. I could feel our connection growing. We had been enacting the cycle of absence and presence, coming together and ripping apart, losing and finding, and in this moment could meet in a mutual place that suspended this cycle so that it could become a vantage point from which to reflect and a source of significance. Okay, almost done. Ogden wrote that one needs an other to infuse human experience with meaning, to bring experience to life. But when this potentially vitalizing other is missing or emotionally unavailable, what once held the capacity to animate or vivify becomes an absence, an empty space devoid of meaning. For many, like Jenny, human bonds feel futile and meaningless. The question of how to reach these patients in a way that does not traumatically intrude or overwhelm with annihilation anxiety is a technically challenging one. Because of the power of early defenses and the life or death quality of human interactions, patients who have experienced traumatic separations may need to be allowed to find or create the mother they need within the analytic relationship. Attempts to intervene based on the rhythms, expectations, or needs of the analyst are often experienced as traumatic intrusions that could potentially pierce a protective barrier, and as such must be mortally defended against. In order to reach such a patient, she must be free to find and discover what she needs inside of the analyst, as if it has come from inside of herself, just as Winnicott's baby believes it has magically created the breast. The fantasy of creation of the analyst's breast provides a primary illusion of oneness, so that the vulnerability of the patient's need is not experienced or exposed. Especially when dependence has been disappointing or traumatic, attempts to give to the patient based on the analyst's own needs can be experienced as coercive or intrusive, foreign bodies that threaten to interrupt the idiom of the self, and so must be ejected from the patient's system. As an alternative, the metaphor of the mirror box brings to mind Winnicott's notion that a mother and child live and experience together when the pair meet in a moment in which each of their desires temporarily coincide, creating an illusion that blurs the lines between internal and external worlds. In this convergence, the mother's provision intersects with what the child wants, an offering which he is free to accept either as an extension of his omnipotent control or as a part of the external world separate from himself. If this junction occurs in a way that is attuned and digestible to the child, the overlap creates a transitional space between outer and inner realities, such that the child may begin a process of creating himself and others in symbols. Treating the phantom pain of an internal absence within the mirror box of the analytic frame requires the repeated reliving of the original experience of traumatic loss in a non-intrusive analytic relationship, a recreation of what is missing within the dreamlike space of the transferential field. As Bion wrote, the analyst must focus his attention on O, the unknown and unknowable. With this, the analyst cannot be identified. He must be it. The analyst is receptive to the full range of the patient's communications on sensory, bodily, as well as affective and intellectual levels, and makes her inner contents available to be used to become early objects in an array of different manifestations. Specific internal resonances bring aspects of patient and analyst to the fore in the context of the intersection of two internal worlds, such that lost parts of the patient's self can be linked up, recognized, and given significance. But this recognition cannot come in by force or coercion. It arises organically in the overlap of two lives lived together. This requires the analyst's effective openness, presence, and attention to internal resonances, to allow herself to be used in the service of creating the environment in which the patient's early object relationships can come to life. Just as a family lives together through a multitude of daily occurrences and wide ranges of affects and intimacies, gaining a deep, often unspoken familiarity with the inner workings of each member, so too does an analyst reside in the psychic reality of the patient, gaining a deep sensory knowledge of the other that cannot be put into words. This shared lived experience requires surrender and permeability to the affective world of the other, a radical presencing in which the analyst lives in deep communion with the patient's inner experience, allowing its uniqueness to impact and transform her own internal world. This creates opportunities to welcome in and reach parts of the patient that have remained unrelated, hidden in an isolated world of things out of fears of human connectedness. Sharing in the language of sensation and experiential engagement brings these isolated parts into the realm of an intersubjective lived experience, in which a wordless or absent state can be understood from within that position, while also being moved into a transformative interpersonal relationship. In my work with Jenny, we oscillated between lived experiences of total presence and total absence. Learning from and resonating with her unique language of absence helped me to engage in the process of experiencing and making sense of our interactions, giving me the space to contemplate her internal world, and ultimately to the ability to take responsibility for and reflect on my own absence from the treatment. This translated into a more mutually contained experience of her regressed states, so that Jenny could eventually begin to safely make contact with and reclaim vital parts of herself. For patients like Jenny, the phantom pain of the absent umbilical link can be discovered and lost, experienced and re-experienced, taken in and spat back out again, on a visceral level through the sensory and inactive dimensions of analytic treatment. Being framed and brought to life within the mirror box of psychoanalysis, patient and analyst create chains of signification in different registers of communication, allowing for integration in the non-intrusive medium of lived experience. When the patient is able to gather her lost and dissociated parts into herself, she herself can become a source of meaning. The internal absence transforming from an empty void into the presence of absence. The patient may then begin to, quote, taste the freedom that recognition of lack provides, to treasure the space made possible by real absence, a gap not stuffed by falseness. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful paper. I think it takes time also to digest it because it has so much in it and it's so complex, but we'll just go on, and whoever wants to read it again will be able to do it. And I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Dana Amir to discuss Rachel Sofer's unique paper. Dr. Amir is a clinical psychologist, a training analyst in the Israeli Psychoanalytic Society. She's the director of the interdisciplinary doctoral program in psychoanalysis at Haifa University. Dr. Amir is also a poet and a literary critic. She has published 2 books of essays. Cleft Tongue, Tehom Safa, was published in English in 2014 by Karnak, and On the Lyricism of the Mind, Aliriyut Shel HaNefesh, was published in 2016 by Routledge. She has already published 6 poetry books. And Dr. Amir participated also in the committee of the Wynnicott Award. Please.
Thank you, Chayuta, and thank you, Rachel, for the beautiful paper. My discussion is entitled Phantom Pains, Phantom Language. כאן יש אקו, נכון? להרחיק. Rachel dedicates her beautiful paper to the notion of a mental phantom pain associated with the removal of a mental organ. In order to allow the self to survive a premature experience of separation, a mental part undergoes amputation and becomes disconnected from the other parts of the psyche, so that contact with it is lost. The only remaining sign of its existence is in the form of phantom pains, pains whose source is unknown or unthinkable and which are not amenable to treatment. A defense structure thus emerges, as Sofer describes it, which, though preserving functional aspects, comes at the cost of the creation of a whole at the very core of the personality. My discussion tonight centers on the singular language that is the result of this structure and which I would like to call a phantom language. How do we picture a language body that comes to compensate for an amputated language organ? Jenny, whose analysis is described in Rachel's presentation, is a journalist. She uses language routinely and freely, or at least so it seems. Yet, deep-seated parts of herself are incommunicado. Maintaining a fluent and correct layer of communication, her language compensates for a wordless, pre-symbolic stratum which remains unexpressed, but does again and again interfere with the flow and the volume of language. As a result, her language holds things on one level while losing hold of them on another. One could call it a kind of autotomy of language, referring to Ofra Eschel's notion. In order to preserve its adult and functional part, language casts off the infantile part. Achieving an appearance of integrity, language actually suffers a serious fracture which leaves the higher register of speech spotless but lacking any vitality. One might interpret Jenny's dream also from this vantage point. In this dream, she has a baby whom she must feed, but she keeps losing it. Each time she finds the baby and starts feeding it, feeling relieved, she somehow loses it again. One might think of the baby as the absent object which Jenny's language briefly captures but doesn't manage to nourish, losing its grip time and again. The phantom language produced by Jenny's phantom pains is a language that simultaneously gives meaning and voids it, enables thinking and attacks thinking. Disguised as a means to associate and connect, this language actually dissociates the speaker from her own deep feelings. This has to do with what I call pseudo-language. Pseudo-language is a language that produces a correct speech which lacks truthfulness. While being perfectly smooth, it actually serves as a partition between the individual and his or her inner world, and eventually comes to hermetically insulate the person from the truth she cannot bear, instead of being the tool by means of which this truth can be touched and expressed. Jenny's phantom language can be considered a subcategory of pseudo-language. Unlike the latter, Jenny's language does not simply aim to disconnect. Her phantom language creates a double movement of bringing to life and annihilating, of drawing and erasing. Like its addressee, it is present in its absence and absent in its presence, remaining in that way elusive and untouchable. Rachel actually puts it this way in her paper. We worked well on the face of it, she writes. The contents that came up were rich, it seemed, and yet something was erased at the end of each meeting, as if to signal that what appeared to be grasped or held was actually being dropped. Rachel mentions the need to mourn over the lost, dissociated parts of the personality. I would like to add in this context that there is a profound link between the work of mourning and the work of language. The capacity to establish language is conditioned both upon individuation and upon the ability to grieve. Indeed, establishing language enacts a similar ambivalence to that which takes place in the process of mourning, as it implies both an adherence to the object as well as the capacity to let it go and recreate it within. Once individuation is experienced as insufferable, so does the creation of language. Not only because the psyche refuses to give up the omnipotent illusion that the other inhabits within, an illusion which makes speech superfluous, since there is no need to name something unless we experience it as existing at some distance or with some degree of separateness from us. But also because speech itself demands separation. It assumes the very capacity to abstract the object from the concrete world of senses, recreating it in a substitutive world of signifiers. Upon losing mother and relying on negation, I retrieve her as a sign, an image, a word, writes Julia Kristeva in a chapter of her book Black Sun, entitled The Omnipotent Meaning. Pontalis, one of the major contributors on the link between language and melancholy, writes in a similar context. Language is simultaneously mourning made real and unending. What does that there is nothing to say denote but the stupefied, stubborn refusal of that same work of mourning, into whose hands the lost object, the nameless thing, and the sentenceless truth delivers us. And further on in the same essay, a language that ignores the loss that creates and animates it, a language convinced that it proclaims truth, will not turn but on itself. Putting these quotes together with the developmental trajectory Rachel describes, a child that does not experience the primary maternal totality will be unable to sufficiently let go of her in order to evolve an authentic and autonomous language. Instead, such a child will create an omnipotent language which declines the work of mourning that makes vital speech possible. This is Jenny's phantom language. It actually acts the opposite of living language. Rather than simultaneously taking hold and letting go, an act of conjoined clinging and releasing that issues in a vital and meaningful linguistic potential space, her phantom language, unable to achieve integration, shifts between the pole of absolute holding and that of absolute disconnection. During a critical phase in Jenny's analysis, the following image occurs to Rachel. Seated together in Rachel's office, a kind of lifeless body lies between them, which is connected to the arms of both of them by means of tubes that in their turn connect to each of the body's arms. Through these tubes, life juices coming from Jenny and Rachel flow into the motionless body, keeping it somehow suspended between life and death. One might interpret this image as a certain alternative to the individual phantom language of Jenny, trapped in its silencing and paralyzing circularity. It is the alternative of a shared language, one that may emerge within the analytic dyad and as a result of it. In Rachel's image, the dead object is held jointly, an act of holding as a result of which the object remains connected. We might think of it in the following way. Whenever the language of one of them drops the object, the other's language takes hold of it. In this way, the flat pendulum movement between the extremes of absolute presence and absolute absence transforms into a dialectic movement in which presence and absence both negate and confirm one another and thus generate a living linguistic space. I feel like a hole, Jenny tells Rachel in a tiny voice. Like you are in a hole? Rachel asks. No, like I am a hole, says Jenny. Their common living language is Jenny's one chance to shift from being a whole to owning the experience of a whole. Owning the experience of a whole means owning her internal world. It is what makes the whole difference between falling forever, the experience of being a whole, and the ability to stop the fall by inhabiting it in thinking and language.
Thank you very much. I think that you have brilliantly tried to describe in language something that has no symbolization and no language, just as you in your paper are trying to describe to us the presencing of absence. And I think that these two, the discussion goes very well with the paper. I think that what is most impressive is that it's the issue of presencing absence is a very urgent clinical issue discussed by many theoreticians and clinicians nowadays. And you have presented us with a metaphor that allows us not only to conceive about that theoretically, but also its liveliness and concreteness gives a lot of life to something that is almost impossible to describe. So I think the metaphor in itself can arouse many thoughts and questions. Another topic that I found very interesting is phantom pain, the very concept. I mean, is phantom pain painful? It is. So what is phantom is not the pain, but the absence. So I think this concept is so useful for psychic situations that are embedded with deadness, because there is a pain and there are many manifestations for the absence. The absence is not void. It has a lot of manifestations as you describe, even if in the futility, in the sense of emptiness and being a whole. So this is another issue I think that can be discussed. And I think that the main thing that you're very courageous and honest and open about is that these psychic situations can be resolved or worked through only with a total permeability and involvement of yourself. And without recognition of how you are actually, it's not only in fantasy, it's not, the mirror box is not a fantasy box, it's very concrete and very real in the concrete relations between analyst and patient. It wasn't a fantasy what happened between you two, it really happened. So I think this is another issue to think about, how these matters are really dealt with in analysis. I mean, we could, this is a very complex issue. Before giving you the opportunity to say the last words, I would like to add that maybe we can think about the mirror box when we use it in a psychoanalytic situation or thinking, that actually we're talking about the interbeing of two minds, of two people that reflect, and not just reflect, but really live each other in very concordant or complementary ways, in many manifestations of connectedness, and that these possibilities create and not only present absence, but also create presence. So please give us your last words.
I think that's a very good point that you're making. Let me just think for a second. No, I think it's interesting to think of it in terms of something that's not just reflective, but active. Something that's a process, and that I think that there's something very generative about thinking about it that way. That's exciting to me. Something, especially with these kinds of patients, where I think it feels like the intersubjective space feels like it could suck both of you in to something that, you know, annihilating, or it feels like it's non-existent altogether. To think of something being generated between two bodies and minds is hopeful to me. So those are my last words. And I want to thank everyone. It's been very inspiring to be here with all of you and to see your dedication, and it's been a great experience. Thank you.